The Lost Track of Time, Chapter 12. Wake up! Wake up! Penelope opened one frazzled eye. Dill was leaning over her, pack in hand. Come on, he begged. She struggled to sit up. What's wrong? The cuckoo stood near the doorway, hopping nervously about. Cuckoo! Time we flew! Yes, we've got to go, Dill practically screamed. No time for explanations. Penelope stumbled over to the cuckoo, slipping on her shoes as she went. Dill cupped his hands together to make a step, and Penelope climbed on board the bird's back. Once she was settled, Dill took a running leap and landed, oomph, behind her. He was barely able to fling his legs up and over before the agitated bird bolted out the door and into the dawn. Penelope couldn't understand what was wrong. It was a beautiful morning. The arms of the sun were just beginning to stretch across the sky. Where the sunlight touched, white clouds turned gold. The gold was reflected in the mountain tops and made their pastel peaks shine. Below the peaks, birds were waking the world with the first songs of the day. "Why are we in such a hurry?" she shouted. Almost as if in answer, she heard the boom of dynamite. Penelope looked down. Swarms of trucks were at the foot of the Cuckoo's mountain. "A crew of workers arrived at my mountain first thing this morning," called the bird. "They've picked up their pace," yelled Dill. "We've got to hurry." The bird veered sharply to the east, toward Kronos City, toward the shadow. Even though morning had arrived over the Cuckoo's mountain, the air here had a gray pallor, as if the sun were shining through a dirty filter. Penelope stared at the wasteland below them. Now she knew the miles of rocks and boulders were the remains of once beautiful mountains. The farther they flew, the flatter the terrain below them grew. The rocks and boulders turned to pebbles and dust. The pebbles and dust turned into a dirt road, and the dirt road gave way to asphalt. The city had begun. The bird started a slow circling descent before landing near a large rock. Dill and Penelope quickly dismounted. When they were both safely on the ground, Dill turned to the cuckoo, hand outstretched. "We'll do our best to find the great Moodler," he promised. "Thank you for all your help." "Yes," agreed Penelope, holding her hand out as well. "Thank you." The cuckoo hesitated for a moment before rushing at Dill and Penelope and scooping them up in his wings. Huge tears slid down his face and splashed onto the asphalt. "Boo-hoo-hoo! Boo-hoo-hoo!" he cried. "Please, do be careful." Penelope and Dill made repeated, although muffled, promises to be as careful as they could, and returned to this spot in 3 days with any news of the great Moodler. The cuckoo finally released them and took off into the air. Dill and Penelope watched him until he disappeared, and then they turned to face the road. "Here goes," said Dill, his voice grim. Penelope shuddered. "Here goes." Off they went, heading for the city, their hearts heavy with the memory of the clockworkers waiting at the foot of the Cuckoo's mountain. As they walked, the sun rose higher in the sky, and the day grew warm. After a while, the road widened from a single lane to 2, then 3, and before blossoming into an intersection. The intersection was shaped like the spoke of a wheel, with roads stretching in 12 different directions. Off in the distance, they could see the outline of the city, running across the entire horizon like a wall. Dill and Penelope came to a halt. "Which road should we take?" asked Penelope. There were so many to choose from. How could they know which one was right? Just then Dill's stomach let out a loud growl. "I'd say follow a hunch, but I'm so hungry I doubt I could get very far. Let's eat breakfast." Dill dug around in his pack for a moment before unearthing a small brown envelope. "Hold out your hand," he instructed, and shook a bunch of tiny gray pellets into Penelope's palm. Penelope just assumed they were some sort of mushroom and popped them into her mouth. "Good gracious!" cried Dill. "One at a time." Too late. The tiny pellets exploded in Penelope's mouth, filling it with a sticky, puffy substance. The pellets grew to 5 times their original size, then 10 times, then 20. "You're eating marshmallows," explained Dill, "a cross between mushrooms and marshmallows. I invented them as rations for long trips, but you really should eat them one at a time." Penelope tried to say, "Got it," but it came out more like, it. "You could live off these for days and days," Dill rattled on, popping a marshmallow into his mouth. "They're full of protein and all sorts of nutrients, not to mention they're yummy, delicious, absolutely scrumptious." Penelope just nodded. Her cheeks were so full they were beginning to hurt. She tried to move the marshmallows around in her mouth, but there was no room to maneuver. "Try sucking on it," offered Dill, and delicately placed another pellet on his tongue. Penelope squeezed in her cheeks and tried to draw a breath. Gurgle. An odd sound came from the back of her throat as her saliva went to work, breaking down the sticky substance. After a few moments, the marshmallows began to shrink and slid down her throat. Gurgle, gurgle. This time the gurgling sound came from her stomach. Penelope looked down in surprise. The marshmallows had continued to expand. It looked like she was carrying a bowl underneath her overalls. "Just a minor side effect," said Dill, patting his own protruding belly. It'll go down in a minute. I might need to fiddle with the recipe a bit." They sat there quietly digesting their breakfast, until Dill let out a laugh. "Look, I've got a hunch." He was staring out of the corner of his eye at a tiny, translucent creature on his shoulder. He cocked his head to one side so he could listen to it better. "Someone's coming," he said slowly, as if repeating what he heard. Penelope didn't like the sound of that. She quickly swallowed the last of her marshmallows. "Someone who?" she asked. Dill listened to his hunch. His thick brows huddled over his eyes. Someone from the city," he said finally. They heard them before they saw them. Far off in the distance came the sound of sirens. The sound grew louder and louder as it grew closer and closer. Soon they saw the lights, flashing lights that quickly became police cars. The cars approached from every direction, speeding down each of the 12 roads until, screech! 12 squad cars came to a stop at the same exact moment. Click! 12 car doors opened, and 12 uniformed police officers stepped out. Slam! 12 car doors closed. 12 police officers glared from under 12 hats, their lips flattened in grim frowns. Each officer had a large patch sewn onto his or her left shoulder with black, angular markings on it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Penelope knew what the markings were. She had seen them before on a grandfather clock. 6, 7, 8. They were Roman numerals, and they were used to mark time. 9, 10, 11. Sure enough, the numbers went all the way to 12. Suddenly, a voice shouted at them through the bullhorn. "Halt right there!" Dill and Penelope stood frozen in the middle of the intersection as a peculiarly short police officer stepped forward. He was shaped like a fire hydrant, with a square lump of a head sitting on a pair of necklace shoulders. "It's 11 a.m. and you're under arrest for idling at the crossroads. I am Officer 10, man of the hour and keeper of the timepiece." The policeman whipped out a pocket watch and dangled it in front of Penelope and Dill. "As you can see, you've disturbed the peace." The watch did seem disturbed. The second hand swung wildly around, and the minute hand was actually moving backward. Officer 10 snatched the watch back and snapped the cover closed. "You'll have to come with me," he barked. Penelope's mouth dropped open. They couldn't go with him. This wasn't part of the plan. She whirled around and stared at Dill, willing him to do something. Dill straightened his jacket and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir, but we—" "Now!" yelled the officer, pointing at the squad car. "We haven't got all day." Dill and Penelope both cringed and scurried over to the car. Once they had reached the door, Officer 10 leaned forward and snatched Dill's pack from his back. "I'll take that," he said, dumping the contents on the ground. He poked at things with his foot, making sure to stomp on the leftover sandwiches. He stopped when he saw the Moodler hat. "What's this?" Penelope held her breath. What would Dill say? If moodling was illegal, then having a moodle hat was certainly forbidden. Dill just shrugged an innocent shrug. "A toy," he answered. In its collapsed state, the hat did look like it could be a toy. Officer 10 must have thought so too, because he picked it up and threw it as far as it would go. Then he turned back to Dill and Penelope and opened the car door. "Get in." They did as they were told. Officer 10 slammed the door and slid behind the wheel. He executed a quick U-turn and sped off in the direction he had come. 11 police cars followed, sirens screaming. As they drove, the monstrous skyline of Kronos City came closer and closer. Buildings crowded the sky like giants fighting for air, their heads lost in the shadow, their feet swarming with cars. The outskirts of the never-ending city were full of bulldozers, concrete mixers, and giant cranes. It seemed like a new building was completed every minute, and caravans of moving trucks clogged the highways. Penelope thought about the Cuckoo. They were tearing down his mountain for this? It was too horrible to think about. And now their plan to help, to find the great Moodler and stop Kronos, was ruined. Penelope would never moodle again. Dill would never find his lost way, and the Cuckoo's home would be destroyed. Penelope felt more like an anomaly than ever. Just then Dill reached over and gave her hand a squeeze. "Don't worry," he whispered, and began poking his face all over, as if counting warts. Penelope smiled weakly. He was right. Now was not the time to worry. It wouldn't help a bit. Instead, she needed to focus and start working on a new plan. She took a deep breath and tapped her forehead. Dill gave her a knowing look and tapped his forehead too. Good. They were both working on it. Together, they would figure something out. Penelope peered out of the squad car, trying to determine where they were. The city was built around one gigantic structure, the clock tower. It was taller than the tallest skyscraper and visible from every corner of the city. Its sharp spire pointed imperiously at the sky. Beneath the spire were 4 clock faces, one on each of its 4 sides. The clock faces shone with a garish green light. They peered down on the city, bathing it in a hateful glow. The sun was nowhere to be seen. Even from miles away, Penelope could see exactly what time it was on the tower. 10:48 and 32 seconds. 33 seconds. 34 seconds. She was mesmerized by the second hand as it swung around and around. Where did all the time go? She wondered. Dill nudged her sharply. If you stare at it too long, you'll reset your internal clock. Penelope looked away from the clock and watched the scenery instead. By now the highway had turned into a 20-lane expressway. All the cars they passed were either black or white, depending on their size. Officer 10 merged into a special lane reserved for police, and soon they were moving at high speed, leaving the traffic behind in a blur. Penelope read the billboards whizzing past. Idleness is the greatest prodigality. Time lost is never found again. All things are easy to industry, all things difficult to sloth. Oh, shut up, thought Penelope. There was something irritatingly familiar about these sayings. She glanced back at the clock tower. Just to check the time, she told herself. Penelope could only see one clock face, but it seemed to be staring right at her. The second hand, 22, 23, 24, moved beautifully around. 25, 26, 27, and around. Penelope scrunched her eyes and gave her head a quick shake. She leaned back in the seat and tried to erase the image of the clock tower from her mind. Dill had said staring at the tower would reset her internal clock, but what exactly was an internal clock? She remembered a painting she had seen in a book. There was a clock that looked like it was made of silly putty. It hung draped over a tree limb, almost ready to slide off onto the ground. Is that what my internal clock looks like? She wondered. Penelope didn't think so. Her clock had wings, she decided. Instead of a nasty beeping alarm, it tickled her when it was time to go somewhere. Just then Dill put his hand on her shoulder. "We're here," he whispered. Something about the way he said "here" made Penelope's throat constrict. Before she could take a good look out the window, the car came to an abrupt halt, and Officer 10 hopped out. "Let's go," he snapped. Dill and Penelope stepped out of the car and into a dark terminal. The terminal had a low concrete ceiling and concrete walls to match. On each wall, a large metal clock chipped away the time, filling the air with its ticking. Everywhere Penelope looked, she saw men and women in identical blue overalls and hats, moving stiffly in and out of dark gray doors. "Where are we?" she asked. Officer 10 turned to look at her, a menacing glare in his eyes. "We're in the clock tower, young lady. It's time for you to get busy." That's the end of chapter 12. See you next time.